It's quite a rare opportunity for me to speak to so many of you in this type of setting. And so I'd like to devote the talk today to talk a little bit about myself, about my background, about my story. I'm sure many of you have seen me walking around the temple, even before I was ordained as a monk. And a lot of you are probably wondering, after seeing such a young monk, what's his story? Why did he become a Buddhist monk? So I'd like to spend the next 15 minutes or so just talking about my story and why I decided to become a Buddhist monk. Okay, so as many of you know, I was ordained at this temple last October. It was a very emotional ceremony for us. It was me and another nun by the name of Shanjing Fashi, and she has now returned to Hong Kong. And the ceremony was a very emotional experience for the both of us. We had chosen Avalokiteshvara's ordination day as the day for our ordination. And I can tell you that every moment that passed during that day is still vividly present in my memories. I can still remember the fragrant scent of incense and flowers during that day. The flowers looked extra beautiful to me, and it was a very touching and very emotional experience. I will probably go on to remember that day as one of the major turning points in my life. The point that marked the biggest leap forward so far in my path of spiritual discovery. So I was born and raised here in Richmond to a Buddhist family. And so I was introduced to Buddhism at a very young age. Ironically, though, my parents decided to send me to a Catholic elementary school in Vancouver. I suppose they wanted me to get exposure to other religions as well at an early age. So after I finished elementary school, I went on to attend St. George's High School, a well-known all-boys private school in Vancouver. It's known for its elite pool of rich, spoiled kids and type A overachievers. Neither category was very good, but I believe I personally fell into the latter. So after I graduated from high school, I went to the US for university. I really didn't lose my craving for higher achievement, and so I decided to enroll at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, which is a school that's quite well known for turning out high-flying Wall Street investment bankers and larger-than-life business executives. And so in my third year of university, I got exactly what the school had advertised. I landed myself a very prestigious summer internship at an investment bank called Merrill Lynch in Hong Kong. I'm not sure if you're aware, but back then, before the financial crisis, investment bankers, they lived the high life. They would sport themselves with a custom tailored suit, fancy tie and all, and they would often be spoiled by these lavish corporate outings. And they probably earned more than they deserved. But at that time, I thought that my life was going to be very promising. But beneath the facade of success and fortune that made this new lifestyle so attractive to me, also lay great danger. There's a good reason why they say you have to sell your soul to thrive in this industry, and I was really beginning to see why. working in a very high-stress environment for almost 20 hours a day, frequently listening to verbal profanity and false speech, and ending long days at work with visits to the local bar and club just to try to numb the senses after a hard day's work. So it was a work hard, play hard mentality, and for some people, they ended up even playing with fire. And so at the end of that internship, I looked back and I began to question the morality and the meaning of what I had put myself through in those 3 months. Deep down, I knew that I had made the wrong choice, but my karma continued to pull me towards it, especially after they had given me a full-time offer for a permanent position after graduation. So it was actually my mother who saved me from it the following year after my graduation. So in May of 2009, after I had graduated from university, I learned that my mother's cancer had relapsed. And the cancer had started to metastasize into her vital organs. I know a few of you here knew my mother, like Lee and Bunny. They actually got to know her quite well. But for those of you who don't know, my mother was one of the founders of this Buddhist temple. And other than the Venerable, is largely responsible for everything that you see at this temple here today. She devoted her whole life to this meaningful project, and without her contribution, you would not be seeing such a beautiful place here, with such beautiful, exquisite buildings and majestic statues. So anyhow, after I had graduated from university, my mother's critical condition forced me to put aside those career plans, and so I came back to Vancouver to be with her so that I could care for her. And it was during this period that I started to become more spiritual. So not long after, the doctors here decided that she was too ill for treatment. And so they started to refer her to palliative care. And we didn't want to give up. We wanted to continue to fight on. So out of desperation, we reached out to a family friend in China who was able to connect us with a hospital in Shanghai that was willing to treat her. And so we were on the first flight out of Vancouver, and we arrived shortly in Shanghai, and not long afterwards, my mother started her treatment. During this whole process, my family and I, we never gave up in our prayers, and it was also during this time that I noticed my spirituality beginning to grow. It wasn't long before the treatment that my mother took on miraculously seemed to work, and she started to feel better again. It was during that time that she encouraged me to begin my job search again. And so I did as she told, and I began to look for another job. I knew that investment banking was not going to be the right fit for me. And so I decided to look elsewhere in my field of finance, and I ended up finding a job at an investment fund in San Francisco. And it was a dream job for me, the job that I had been waiting for all 4 years of my life, studying at university. But as we all know, the nature of life is very impermanent. And 1 month later, my mother fell sick again. And I rushed back to Shanghai to be with her. But by then, the cancer had already spread throughout her body. So what happened next was what I believe to be my spiritual epiphany, which led me to this path of ordination. So it was on the evening of April 13th, 2010, and I'll always remember what happened on this night very vividly. My sister and I were by my mother's bedside. She was in a very critical condition in the hospital. Her vitals were getting weaker, and she was struggling to stay with us. And so it was during this time that my sister and I started to chant Avalokiteshvara's name by her side, knowing that the time had come for her to leave us. So in the mid-evening, after she had battled cancer very courageously for over 8 years, my mother passed away in the Renji Hospital in Shanghai. So not long afterwards, in the first few hours, my sister and I, obviously we were filled with grief and sorrow, and we really struggled to hold our tears back as we chanted for her. But somewhere in that third hour after her passing, something completely unexpected happened. The sorrow that we had been feeling suddenly turned into jubilation. And there was a deep sense of joy and bliss in our hearts. The feeling was unlike anything I had ever felt before. And my sister felt exactly the same way. So it was this remarkable feeling that was also accompanied by mental images and thoughts of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva coming to receive my mother and leading her to a much better place. It was at this moment that I also heard my mother say to me, she had already passed away, but I heard her say to me in my mind. She spoke in Cantonese. She said, "要修行，唔好再嘥時間，記得啊，最重要都係要修行." So it translates into English as, remember, spiritual cultivation. Don't waste your time any longer. The most important is spiritual cultivation. So after I had heard those words, the joyful feeling that I'd been experiencing gradually subsided, but I still felt a deep sense of peace and well-being, well until the 8-hour window had passed after she had left us. So looking back, it was really this illuminating experience that inspired me to take a new path. It saved me from falling into the pursuit of fame, wealth, and glory. And it was what motivated me to come back to this temple, to take on a new goal in my life, which would be spiritual cultivation. So I came back and I started my work here. Outside of my role as administrator, I would spend a great deal of time studying the Buddhist philosophy. I would regularly practice meditation and chanting. I started to read and chant the Diamond Sutra, and I studied many of its commentaries as well. It was actually the Diamond Sutra that really opened up my mind to what the Dharma was really all about. It talked about non-self, emptiness, impermanence. And I began to understand that the Dharma is essentially a solution to this problem of existence. All human beings think that they exist as independent and endearing entities. And as a result, they selfishly run after all these things that are all dependent on conditions, all subject to impermanence. And because they believe that this is what leads to their happiness, they become attached to it. And they become reluctant to let go of it. And so that's really the cause for our suffering. After I had spent a number of years here with my work at the temple and studying Buddhism and meditating, I noticed that day by day, my spirituality began to grow. And I would regularly spend my weekends and my evenings sitting in meditation. I would be reading a lot more on Buddhist sutras and reading other Buddhist books. I started to practice Azubha Bhavana to curb my desires. And I once actually even went through the trouble of having to explain to a Canadian customs officer what I was doing with a model skeleton in the back trunk of my car as I was crossing the border. So I had to explain to him that I bought it in the US from a medical store because I wanted to use it to work on my Buddhist practice, which involved contemplating on the impurities of the body. And the model skeleton was one such representation of it. And so as I became more devout in my practice, I began to realize that the Dharma is not something that is just available in the Buddhist sutras and in the sermons delivered by the great monks. I began to realize that if you do something with great intensity and you have a real interest in getting to the truth of the matter, then you would arrive at the Dharma. So my foray into the world of triathlon was one of the things that actually ended up giving me great insight into my own spiritual practice. As some of you may know, especially those who have taken part in marathons or other endurance races, training for a triathlon requires an enormous amount of discipline and persistence in your physical training. It also requires a tremendous amount of willpower to overcome all sorts of physical discomfort during your training and your racing. So I was really amazed at the sheer number of hours and the intensity these triathletes would put in to train their bodies to be healthy and fit, all to take on this demanding physical challenge. And in the course of my training with them, it began to dawn on me that while so many people would spend so much time to train their bodies, their physical bodies, to be healthy and fit, how many people would actually take the time to train their minds to be healthy and happy? So after 1 year of triathlon racing, I decided that if I wanted to make the biggest progress in my Dharma practice, that I would need to turn pro. And that for me meant becoming ordained as a Buddhist monk. And so it's been almost 1 year since my ordination, and the transition from layman to monk certainly was not easy. I had its fair share of obstacles to overcome. But I knew that with any meaningful pursuit that you take on, you have to make sacrifices. Albert Einstein, he summed this up very beautifully when he said, I must be willing to give up what I am in order to become what I will be. There can be no success in life without making the right sacrifices. I knew that if I wanted to follow in the footsteps of the great monks and the great Bodhisattvas, that I needed to give up all the attachments. I needed to give up all the sensual pleasures. And I knew that if I wanted freedom from samsara, then I would have to live a life of renunciation, that I would have to let go of all these attachments. And so it's been almost a year now. It's still very early in my journey. And I know that there will be a number of obstacles to overcome in the future. But I do feel very blessed to have gone this far. And I'm very excited about where this path will take me in the future. And so that's my story. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it and was able to perhaps take something out of it as well. So the topic of my talk today will be on happiness. I'm sure this is something that everyone deeply cares about, and is probably something that we can't find enough of in our lives. So what is true happiness? Where does it come from? And what can I do in my life to get more of it? I think these are all very relevant questions to ask. When people usually talk about meaning of life, you get an array of answers. For some people, the meaning of life might be to find the perfect partner, the perfect career, building a vast fortune perhaps, building friendships. For other people, the meaning of life might be to contribute to the world in some way, to make it a better place, living in the service of others, living for something that's larger than yourself. I think we can all agree that the more selfless the aim, the more we generally accept it to be a worthier goal. But if you look at what all these different things aim to achieve, whether it's for yourself or for other people, it's this basic aspiration for happiness that drives our meaning in life. We all want to obtain lasting happiness and to avoid unhappiness. It's a universal goal that we have, and it's a basic constant in all our lives. Even the animals and the beings from the other realms, they also are looking for happiness. They also look for meaning in life and try their best to avoid suffering and pain. So all beings in samsara, we're all looking for the same thing, that one elusive thing that we call happiness. But how many of us are actually able to find it? How many of us can find true happiness? Most people, in their search for pleasures and happiness, end up looking in the wrong places. And they look for sensual gratification, and many of them actually only intensify their suffering. Many young people, for example, they think that happiness is emotional excitement and euphoria, and so they experiment with things like sex and drugs, and they don't realize that that leads to problems with obsession and addiction, which makes them even more vulnerable to suffering. For other people, material wealth might be the prerequisite for a happy life, And so they spend their entire lives working hard for it. But when it comes, they find that it doesn't provide them with the fulfillment they had expected. Instead, they start to worry over it. They worry about protecting their wealth, and they become suspicious when people get too close to them. I think when people often become rich and famous, what happens is your friends and your relatives, they try to find all sorts of reasons to be owed money. So we have to deal with those problems when we become wealthy, and there's often this feeling of emptiness after you are able to obtain the wealth. And so how do we tackle this elusive problem of pursuing happiness? So Buddhism provides some insight here on happiness. Buddhism asks us to investigate what we really think to be happiness. Observe your experience and investigate, look into the true nature of it. Don't just blindly accept what society or those around you deem as happiness. The Buddha warned us not to fall into the trap of adopting the herd mentality and following blindly whatever the accepted notions of happiness are in our society. We should not be like sheep in a flock, all blindly following each other down the cliff of ignorance. But we should really question what the established notions of things are, and we should investigate its true nature. It is the process of questioning and probing that leads to real happiness. And the Buddha went through this process himself 2,600 years ago when he abandoned the worldly life in search of a solution to this problem of life and death. And when he became enlightened, he realized the Four Noble Truths, that life is characterized by suffering, that the cause for our suffering is due to our craving and selfish desires, that there can be an end to all of this suffering, and that there exists a path that can lead us to true and lasting happiness. So what the Buddha discovered was that what most people regard as happiness is actually suffering. And what they take to be suffering is actually happiness. Most people think that happiness is derived from the satisfaction of your senses. They think that the more pleasures you experience through the senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, that the happier you are. But we know that pleasure arising from the senses is only short-lived in nature, and it doesn't last. It's very impermanent. It is also inherently unstable and always subject to change. In fact, it's because of its changeability that pleasure can easily turn into its polar opposite of suffering at any time. So when our goal begins to seek sense gratification, our mind turns outward toward all these external sense objects, and we begin to crave for these pleasurable sensations. When they are present, we feel temporarily satisfied, but as soon as they are absent, we begin to feel unfulfilled and uncomfortable again. Pleasurable sensations are also insatiable. The more we have, the more we want, and the better we want it. It's very much like a leaking water vessel. No matter how much water you put into it, you can't seem to get enough. And there's always this feeling of emptiness that can never be filled. As soon as a pleasurable sensation has ended, you try to fill it in with another one, but all that does is just reinforce its illusion of happiness. So it's very much like an example of plastering over a crack in the wall, thinking that by doing that you can fix the crack. what happens is when the plaster dries, the crack reappears again, and you're left with the same problem. So pleasurable sensations, they don't make us any better off. In fact, the Buddha said that the craving for it is what leads to our chronic suffering. So if pleasurable sensations don't lead to our happiness, and if it can't be found in the outside world, which is all subject to conditions and impermanence, then where can it be found? Well, the problem with us is that because of all the conditioning we've been subjected to in our present life and in previous lives, we think that happiness is something that needs to be found outside of ourselves. In things like wealth, status, romantic love, friendship, achievement, and so forth. We're continually running after all these things, thinking that they will bring us happiness. So the analogy I like to use for this is like running on a treadmill. On a treadmill, you can run at whatever pace you set, but regardless of how fast you run, you never get anywhere. In fact, the faster you go, the more quickly you just tire yourself out. So in life, it's really just the same. If you continually run after all these external things in your life, the more pleasure you seek, the more wealth and fortune you try to accumulate, the more achievements you go after, the more you just quickly tire yourself out. And the sad part is, you're getting nowhere in life. So the Buddha taught us that happiness is just one step away. All you need to do is to stop running, step away from the treadmill, and see the beauty and peace that's available in the present moment. You don't need to do any more running. You've been running for far too long, lifetime after lifetime, always looking for more, always chasing after wind. So if we can realize that all we have to do is just step away from that treadmill, then we can begin to see the peace that's available in the present moment for us. And when we make peace with the present moment and be kind to it, then that's when true happiness ensues. So we don't need to look elsewhere. All we need to do is stop. In fact, that's what we mean when we talk about nirvana. Nirvana is just the stopping of all of this movement until we reach a state of perfect peace, stillness, and happiness. So the critics of this might say it's easy to say all of this, that happiness is only available in the present moment, but how do you actually go about applying this in your life? Well, finding true happiness, like any other skill, like playing the piano or learning a new language, requires consistent practice and training. Training your mind to be mindful of everything that's happening in the present moment. Being aware of when you're stepping back onto that treadmill again. And learning to be here in the present, here and now. We know that external circumstances are beyond our control. We can't change life, but we can certainly change how we look at it. By meditating, we can learn to put away all our worries and to make peace with whatever it is that we're experiencing. When we can do this, we begin to let go, and that's when we begin to find true happiness. This ability to let go, to not get buried in the thoughts of the past or the worries of the future, that's actually something we've all experienced before, to some extent, even if we haven't practiced meditation. So the feeling you get after you achieve a goal, complete a really difficult task, or after an intense workout at the gym, usually that's a feeling of deep calm and relaxation, when all the tension that's been built up in your body is released. And for a very short moment, your mind is completely still, and peaceful. So if we could think about how we feel during that short moment, which is in itself dependent on conditions, the deep sense of well-being and flourishing that we felt, then just imagine one who is in complete peace and at one with himself, one who is able to be in the present moment, putting down everything. Imagine how much peace and happiness he would feel. I don't think I can even begin to imagine how much bliss and happiness you would feel at that level. So if you really want true happiness in your life, you must make the conscious effort to put in the training and practice to make your mind happy. Let go of all the attachments to the sense pleasures. Be fully alive to the here and now. I know that many of you realize the value of this, otherwise you wouldn't be coming to our meditation class every Saturday. But if once a week is all the time that you have for meditation, then that is not enough. Just like you can't expect your body to feel comfortable if you bathe or brush your teeth for just once a week. You have to put consistent practice into it in order to realize its benefits. So I hope that everyone can learn to get off their treadmills and start investing in your own happiness. Thank you for listening. So last week in my talk, I spoke about happiness, what is true happiness, and how do you go about finding this elusive thing called happiness from a Buddhist perspective. I'd like to devote the talk today on a completely different subject. I'd like to give you a brief introduction on Buddhism as a science of the mind. So we know that Buddhism is a religion and philosophy that was founded by the Buddhist Sakyamuni almost 2,600 years ago. But can Buddhism also be regarded as a science? So before I get into a discussion of this, I'd like to first share a quote with all of you by Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein, he said, "The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology. Covering both natural and spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of all things, natural and spiritual, and a meaningful unity." Buddhism answers this description. If there is any religion that could cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism. So is Buddhism really a science? In order to answer this question, we have to first understand that there are two types of sciences. There's the physical science and there's the mental science. In the physical science, it's concerned with the study of matter or physical objects. In the mental science, it's concerned with the study of the mind. The mind is a subjective experience, whereas matter is an objective one. So to examine matter, we have to focus our attention outwards. We have to use our senses to perceive matter. And in the physical sciences, they rely on instruments such as telescopes and microscopes to enhance their ability to perceive matter. On the other hand, in the mental science, we have to direct our attention inwards. It's an introspective process. As you know, the field of mental science that developed to study the mind is known as psychology. And in its early days, the branch of behavioral psychology that developed used extroverted means. They studied the outward behavior of humans and animals in order to understand the mind. The introspective process that was supported by many psychologists, one of which is Sigmund Freud, who is the founding father of modern psychotherapy. Their theories of introspection were rejected because it was seen as unscientific, because none of it could be tested externally by physical measurements like what you could in the physical sciences. So it was later discovered by the cognitive psychologists that looking at the human behavior of animals and humans, that was simply not enough. A full understanding of the mind could only be achieved by looking inwards towards our deepest inner experiences. It could still be very scientific though, because if you look at what science is simply a method. It's a method that can be summarized into 3 steps: observation, hypothesis, and verification. So you observe a particular phenomenon, you make a hypothesis about it, you make an inference and draw a conclusion about what you see, and that conclusion is not accepted until it's verified by experimental observation. So that's how it becomes a science. So Buddhism is really a science of the mind, because even though it can't be tested physically or externally, it can be verified through direct personal experience. So Buddhism is a science that uses the direct investigation and direct personal experience to understand and study the mind. So we know from reading the Dhammapada that the mind is the forerunner of all things. The Buddha told us that the mind experiences phenomena in the world, and everything is mind only, that nothing exists outside of the mind. Everything that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, those are all creations of the mind. Everything in this meditation hall, Buddha statues behind me, the wall paintings, the meditation stools that you're sitting on, even the people that are here today with us, people you see right in front of you, they're all creations of the mind. So for those who haven't been introduced to this topic, I know it can sound a bit abstract and difficult to understand. It certainly was for me the first few times I heard it. But what the Buddha was trying to say was that all phenomena that you experience, whether it be in the nature, the trees, mountains, oceans, the earth, all possible objects that you can perceive through the sense of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, are all just mental projections that have been created by your mind. We think that objects exist as they really are. We think that what we see is an objective reality. But the Buddha told us that what we see is just a mental image that's distorted by the various different karma and mental states that we have. We know that 2 artists looking at the same scene can produce 2 very different paintings with large variations in color, texture, and shape. This distortion is even more apparent across sentient beings from the 6 realms of existence. So according to the Buddha, what we human beings see as just a regular pool of water, hungry ghosts, they see it as a pool of pus and blood. And heavenly devas, they see it as a land of shining crystal. So of course, within the human realm, there aren't such major distortions because we share very similar mental faculties. But the point is that what we perceive does not go beyond what the mind can experience. And everything exists in the mind only. In fact, there's not much meaning to talk about anything that exists outside of the mind, Because if there isn't a mind to perceive that thing, then that thing doesn't exist. So how is it that we perceive? The Buddha described this process in 5 steps, what we call the 5 aggregates, or the 5 skandhas. And we're usually accustomed to hearing the 5 skandhas in the particular order of form, feeling, conception, volition, and consciousness. But I'd like to present it in a slightly different order and with some minor variations in the translation of the terms to give you a better understanding of how everything we perceive is just in the mind and doesn't exist outside of the mind. This variation has been accepted and supported by many monks and Buddhist scholars, one of which is Bhante Punnaji. He is a very well-known Sri Lankan Theravada monk, and he has made some great contributions to Buddhist psychology. So the 5 skandhas in this particular order are feeling, sensation, mental construction, perception, and mental image. So you'll notice that instead of putting form up in the very front, we've now put it at the very end. And we've translated it not as form, but as a mental image, a mental form. And I'll go about explaining why a bit later on, why this is the case. But let's first examine how the process of perception works. So everything first starts off with an object that stimulates the senses. So we can use the example of our sense of sight. So our eyes can only see in color. We don't see in full images. So when an object comes within our field of vision, what happens is our eyes, we detect the light that's reflected from the object. When this happens, there are 2 things that occur at the same time. The first is the feeling. In Pali, it's called the Vedana. And the second is the sensation, or the sanya. The feeling is the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensation when you get when you see something. And in this case, it refers to the different colors that you see. And the sensation refers to the contact, the light falling on your eyes. So when this happens, if I were to describe it in medical terms, the nerve endings in our retina detects the frequency or the wavelength of the colors that you see. And it sends those signals to the brain. When it reaches the brain, it begins to process all the different signals that have been received. And it puts all the colors together and begins to form a mental image. This activity of creating the mental image, that's called in Pali sankhara, which means construction. So it's a form of mental construction. So when you look at something, you're not just creating one construct, you're creating multiple different constructs. And each construct that you build, you give a name to it. And so you start noticing how one construct is related to another, and you put them together. So an example would be, you look at a face, and you see the nose, the eyes, the ears, and the mouth. And you relate all of these different features together relative to the face. And so you begin to interpret and give meaning to what you see based on what's in the present and what's available in your stored memory. So we call this vijnana, and it's translated as perception. And the resultant image that's created in your mind, that is called rupa, or mental image. Rupa can also be translated as form. But in this case, because we're saying that everything is a product of the mind, that there is no matter that exists outside of the mind, we've put it at the very end and we've translated it as a mental image. And this mental image, that is simply a process of perception. It is the product of what we perceive. So we can begin to see that everything in the world is just a creation of this process of perception that the Buddha referred to as the 5 aggregates. So now that we know this, how does this help with our practice? So if we know that everything we see are just clusters of images in the mind, and we know that we can't take things to be a true reality, then we can learn not to be so attached to our views and perceptions, because all they are creations of this conditioned mind. Instead, we should investigate and question what we see, knowing that our mind is filled with biases and perceptions that color our world and often can give us a false view of the true reality. So the mind is a process that happens unconsciously. You don't realize that it's happening unconsciously, but that's essentially what is happening in your mind. You don't need to be conscious of the process of perception in order for you to perceive. It happens all unconsciously. But it's through meditation and mindfulness that we can begin to be conscious of this unconscious process of the mind. So what that means is that instead of looking at what you see, you're looking at how you see. And you're much closer to the truth when you look at how you see over what you see. So the true nature of reality is something that can be discovered by unveiling the true nature of the mind, because it is the mind that creates everything. When the Buddha became enlightened, he became fully conscious and awakened to this unconscious process of the mind. And in doing so, he also became fully enlightened to the true nature of reality. So Buddhism has a lot to say about the mind. The Buddhist method is all about understanding the mind and freeing it from the delusions that lead us to suffering. What I've talked about today is only a very tiny, minuscule fraction of what the Buddha taught on the process of perception relating to the 5 senses. Apart from the 5 senses and the 5 consciousness, we know that there's also the 6th consciousness, what we call the mano. And in the Mahayana, we have the 7th and the 8th consciousness, known as the manas and the alaya or store consciousness. So the literature on all of this is very profound, and it's incredibly vast. You can easily spend your entire life studying the profound teachings in this particular school of Buddhism that we call Vijnanavada. But what I find very amazing about all of this is that what the Buddha taught about the mind almost 2,600 years ago, modern science is only beginning to discover. And everything that they're discovering only validates what the Buddha has said. So maybe Einstein was right. Maybe Buddhism is the one religion that's able to cope best with modern scientific needs. If that's the case, then the Buddha was not only a great teacher who found and taught others the way to enlightenment, but he was also the greatest scientist that ever lived. So thank you for listening. When I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to touch on a subject that would have some real practical implication in our lives, something that would offer some tangible benefits to us and would help us relieve us from some of the suffering that we experience from time to time. The thing about suffering is that if you just ignore it, it doesn't go away. There's the old saying that ignorance is bliss, that you'll live a happier life if you just sweep all your problems and afflictions under the rug and pretend as if they never happened. And a lot of people do choose to do that in their life. When they encounter any problems or difficulties, they choose to avoid it. And some will turn to the company of their friends to help them feel less lonely and less miserable. Some people will turn to entertainment. They'll kill time by watching TV. They'll seek entertainment to appease their senses. And then you have other people who will get themselves involved in a lot of activities to keep them busy so that they can forget about the problem. Well, the problem with this response is that just by ignoring your suffering, by trying to run away from it, it doesn't go away. It's just like trying to run away from your own shadow. No matter where you try to run to, the shadow will still follow you. Then one may ask the question, well, why would somebody want to do something so foolish as to run away from your own shadow? Well, obviously, to you and me, that would seem like a very foolish and nonsensical thing to do. We know that there's nothing to be afraid of when we see our own shadow. And the reason for that is because we understand it. We understand how a shadow is being formed when we see it. We know that it comes when light is being obstructed by an object, and the size and the intensity of the shadow is determined by a number of different causes and conditions. The brightness of the light source, for example, how big the object is, the angle of the light shining on the object. So we know that there's nothing to be afraid of when we see our shadow because we can identify and we understand its nature. Well, suffering is really just the same. The reason why we fear suffering and the reason why we run away from it is because we don't understand it. We don't realize what the causes and conditions are that make suffering appear in our life. And when it comes to us, we don't know how to deal with it. So it's really this lack of understanding that causes us the suffering in our life, rather than the actual negative event that happens in our life. Suffering is really what we just add on to that event. So the whole point of the Buddha's teachings is to make us understand ourselves and our suffering so that we can live happily and peacefully without fear and worry. So the Buddha told us that this world is characterized by suffering, that its inherent condition is unsatisfactory. We have the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, death, departing from loved ones, being with people you don't like, insatiable desires, suffering from the 5 skandhas. All this is suffering. And then there's also the collective suffering. So the suffering that we experience when we have wars, genocides, natural disaster, famine, hunger. This causes a lot of suffering for a lot of people. Now, when we say this, we should also understand that this is not a pessimistic or cynical outlook on life, but rather it comes from a true understanding of the nature of the world that we live in. It actually takes a lot of courage and wisdom to admit that you're suffering, to want to do something about it, to confront the thing that's bothering you the most in your life and causing you great distress. So I'd like to sidetrack for a little bit. How many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? I'm sure many of you have seen it. It was a big hit back in the late 1990s. I think it was almost 2000 when it first came out. So in the movie, if you remember the scene when Neo first meets Morpheus, they sit down and Morpheus presents Neo with two options. You have the blue pill and the red pill. And then he goes on to say, you take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed, and you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Do you remember that? Does that ring a bell? Well, in the same way, most people in life decide to take that blue pill. They decide to ignore the suffering in their life rather than waking up to the realities of life. When suffering arrives at their doorstep, what they do is, instead of confronting it, they choose to ignore it and bury it deep within their consciousness. And what happens when you do that? Well, it's just like leaving garbage in your house without wanting to do anything about it. Over time, it accumulates, and when it does, it makes you fall sick. And not only that, the unbearable smell forces out all the people that matter most to you in your life. So now that we've established that the current condition that we face is unsatisfactory, that we suffer, and that the suffering is due to a lack of understanding, how do we go about better understanding and relieving some of the suffering that we feel? Well, to answer this question, we first have to ask ourselves, what is suffering? Suffering is simply not having things the way you want them to be. In other words, desiring for things to be other than what they are. That is suffering. You think you're not good enough, not rich enough, not smart enough, not handsome or pretty enough. You don't have a good enough job. The list of not enoughs can just go on and on. And what's worse about all of this is that when you don't meet those expectations, you add to that disappointment by sinking into self-blame and despair and self-criticism. The inner critic in you is very strong. And whenever it finds the chance, it batters you down for your mistakes. It makes you feel that you're worthless. It pummels you for not being better, for not living up to your expectations. And this causes you a lot of suffering. And then you also have the people who have just been put through some terrible atrocities, like war, abuse, rape, torture. There's no question that these people have been through a lot of pain. But why do so many of them continue to suffer years and years after it happened? Well, what happens is they replay the events that took place again and again in their minds. And each time they do that, they feel the pain one more time. It's already long gone. The pain that you felt during that experience is already not here. It's gone. It's not going to come back. But they still have a difficult time letting it go. Why? Well, because they want things to be other than what they are. They can't accept and they haven't come to terms with the experiences of their past. And that's why they suffer. And what about the suffering associated with sickness, aging, and death? Well, yes, there's the pain of sickness. Having diabetes, cancer, going through chemotherapy, there's definitely pain in there, and it will be felt. But like everything else in the world, we also know that it rises and falls, and eventually will go away. When I was with my mother, she was sick with cancer, I was able to experience empathetically through her how painful the process of chemotherapy can be. It is very physically grueling and painful, and it can cause a lot of suffering. But I also know that the pain that you feel is very short-lived. It's temporary in nature. It doesn't last that long. But it is the suffering that arises from the pain that can. The suffering that lingers is not the pain of the sickness, but rather it's the emotional and resistance and fear that we have towards that pain. That's what causes the suffering. So if I were to make an analogy, pain is very much like a gaseous substance. If you just allow it to be there, it'll naturally dissipate on its own. You don't have to do anything to it. But as soon as you fight it, as soon as you resist it, and you force it into the confines of a small area, then that's when the pressure builds up until you get a big explosion. So no matter what kind of suffering we face, we should know that when it comes down to it, suffering comes from wanting things to be other than what they are. And what is happiness? Well, happiness is simply the opposite. It's understanding and accepting the way things are and not wanting them to be any different. That's what happiness is. It comes from not trying to control the circumstances. We know that we can't control the circumstances in our life, but we can change and we can control how we respond to those circumstances. We can't necessarily change life, but we can certainly change how we look at it. And that makes all the difference. But obviously, saying this is very easy. The more important question that we should ask ourselves is, how do we get to that state where we can accept things the way that they are and not want them to be anything different? Well, this is where I'd like to introduce a very powerful technique that has benefited me tremendously over the past year. I'm sure quite a few of you have heard of this term. It's called self-compassion. Compassion, self-compassion. We all know that compassion is a cherished virtue in our society. Extending loving kindness to all sentient beings, eliminating their suffering, that's the hallmark of a bodhisattva. Compassion is also cherished in other religions, like Christianity. You have Jesus Christ Saint Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, all these people, they embody the very definition of what it means to be compassionate. But the problem that we have with that is that, especially in our modern society, while compassion is regarded as a noble virtue, self-compassion, compassion towards yourself, that's often ignored and misconstrued as being self-conceit or self-pride. Some people even say that if you're too self-compassionate to yourself, that you'll end up becoming egotistical and big-headed. Not to mention, we often feel that in order to be a good person, we have to sacrifice our happiness and our well-being for the benefit of others. So self-sacrifice rather than self-compassion is regarded as a nobler virtue. Well, the problem with this is that while we may be kind to those around us, because we're supposed to value them more than we value ourselves, you could be very mean and miserable to yourself and completely accept that as being normal. The problem that then arises is that when you're always mean and critical to yourself, you build up a lot of negative energy in your body. And that energy has to find a way of letting itself out. It has to find some sort of outlet. And when it does, it gets sent out to those around you. And when it gets sent to those around you, other people suffer, and that defeats the whole purpose of self-sacrifice in the first place, because you're not benefiting them anymore. So the right view that we should adopt is to see ourselves as equally deserving of love and compassion as those around us. Didn't the Bible say that we should love our neighbor as ourselves? Right? Not loving our neighbor more than ourselves, but loving our neighbor as ourselves. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have to understand what the difference is between pain and suffering. Pain is the brief burst of discomfort that you feel when you experience a negative event in your life. And suffering comes from the emotional resistance and fear you have towards that pain. And happiness? Happiness is understanding and accepting the way things are and not wanting them to be any different. So how do we get to that state where we can accept things as they are? Well, as I just mentioned, the technique is called self-compassion. When a baby is crying, what does the mother do? The mother cradles the child in her arms, and she gives the baby tender, loving affection and care. The mother knows that it's normal for the baby to experience discomfort at times. And when the baby does, she's there to provide unconditional love and support. Well, when we experience suffering, we should learn to be like that mother. We should cradle our suffering into our arms. We need to recognize that it's there and that it's causing us pain right now. But we don't fight it. We don't resist it. We cradle it into our arms and we give it warmth, understanding, and we remind ourselves that it is okay to experience suffering. It's a normal part of the human experience. It comes and it goes. Eventually it will go away. You don't have to do anything to it. In fact, when you try to do something to it, that's when it really puts up a fight against you. So all you need to do at this moment is to care for your suffering. To know that it's there and that all human beings share this common condition of suffering. We're not in this alone. And that this is the time when we should show ourselves love and compassion the most. And when we begin to care for our suffering like that, well, that's when all the ill will and resentment just naturally disappears. And we begin to accept the way that things are without resisting it. And when we can begin to do that, then that's when we find true peace in our life. So, whenever you have thoughts of inadequacy, if you feel like you're not good enough, you're not living up to your expectations, well, you need to practice self-compassion. You need to show love and appreciation for yourself. You are good enough. You don't need to be any more. In fact, right now, you possess all the qualities that entitle you to joy and happiness. You know that suffering comes from wanting things to be other than what they are. And you also realize that you will never be satisfied in your life until you stop wanting and start being. If you've been hurt by someone in the past, the first thing you need to do is to learn how to forgive yourself. You need to show love and compassion for your suffering. It's okay to be hurt. There's pain right now, but eventually it will go away. And if you resist it and fight it, well, then the pain will only get worse. You should tell yourself that you want to be well and happy again. And so you will only let the pain that you're experiencing right now serve as a stepping stone towards your own personal growth. It will only make you stronger and more resilient. If it's you that made the mistake, or someone that you hurt in the past, well, you should tell yourself that you shouldn't be defined by the actions of your past. If you want to define yourself, you should only define yourself as the quality of how you are living in this present moment. You deserve as much love and happiness as the person you hurt. And you should learn to forgive yourself. It is normal, it is human to make mistakes. And we learn and grow from them. And we should only use them to enrich our lives. So, the good thing about self-compassion is that instead of replacing negative feelings with positive ones, by embracing and caring for your negative feelings, you end up creating new positive feelings. There's actually nothing wrong with experiencing suffering. It's just a natural process that rises and falls with the passing of time. The pain does not last that long, but it's the fear and resistance to it that can really make you suffer. When you stop fighting it and start realizing that, like a crying baby, it too needs to be cared for and loved, then that's when the suffering just naturally fades away. And all you're left with is the peace and contentment that comes from accepting things the way that they are. So, when you come to think about it, no one spends more time with yourself than you yourself do. If you're dealing with someone who's being difficult, you only will have to put up with them for the limited time that you're with them. But if you're always being mean and critical to yourself, if you're always pummeling yourself for not being good enough, for not living to your expectations. If you're always living with ill will and resentment towards your circumstances, then I'm very sorry. You will be living with a very scary and horrible monster 24 hours a day for the rest of your life. Is that the way to a happy and fulfilling life? Well, obviously not. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people do that to themselves. So, if you want to find true peace and happiness in your life, the first step is to confront your suffering. Don't run away from it like trying to run away from your own shadow. Be like Neo in the Matrix. Take the red pill. Wake up to the realities of life. You know, it takes a lot of courage and wisdom to do that. But when you start to do that, then you can start understanding what suffering actually is. And you'll know that suffering comes from wanting things to be other than what they are. And it comes from resistance, and it comes from fear. Once you realize that, then you should use self-compassion as a tool to embrace and care for your suffering. Give it love and understanding. Recognize that it's there, that you're feeling pain right now. Be with it, like a mother holding her baby in her arms. Smile at it. Give it the assurance that even this too will come to pass, and you will be well and happy again. And when you can do this, then you start to experience some true happiness in your life. And all the suffering will just naturally subside and go away. It'll fade into nothingness. And then all you're left with is the peace and contentment that's born of letting go, of accepting things the way that they are. You don't want any more, any less. You don't want things to be any different. Everything is perfect as it is right now. And when you can do that, then that's when you begin to find true happiness and peace in your life.